Afternoon. Welcome to Conspiracies 101 with Benjamin Radford, who will be our special guest today. We're live on Zoom and streaming to YouTube as well. If you're watching that live stream on YouTube, do us a favor and share that wherever you can to let others know that they can watch us live or later on as well. In just a minute, I'll introduce our special guest, Benjamin Radford, but I want to be sure you know a couple of things before we get started. First of all, we really miss seeing all of you in person at our monthly events, but we're still planning many more online events just like this one every 2 weeks to help fill the time until we can get together again. But this has been a great opportunity for us to connect remotely with a lot of people who we normally wouldn't be able to chat with over the monthly get-togethers that we have, because it's a lot more fun to have people here in person, but this has been great lately. We've had some folks that we wouldn't normally see in Florida. And we'll continue to stream these events on YouTube as well. So we have a full schedule of Freethought Cafe and Secular Women events as well. So if you're looking to socially connect while you remain socially distant, we have those options available for you. And that's all at our meetup group at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. And you can find most of those events on Facebook at CFL Freethought. And with that, I'll introduce our guest today. Ben is Deputy Director of Skeptical Inquirer, which is produced by the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, a program that is within an organization that we've all heard of, the Center for Inquiry. He also serves as research fellow at CSI, where his colleagues include Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and many others that you've heard of. In fact, I was there today and I saw they have a fantastic resource that cuts through a lot of the BS that's out there on coronavirus. So you can find that at centerforinquiry.org/coronavirus. Benjamin's written thousands of articles on a wide variety of topics, including urban legends, mysterious phenomena, critical thinking, media literacy, and the topic he'll address today, conspiracies. He's an author and co-author or contributor to over 20 books and speaks across the country at universities, colleges, and conferences, including where I met him just over 10 years ago at the Amazing Meeting in Las Vegas. Of course, he won't remember me because the Amazing Meeting is huge. More than 1,000 attendees, and I was just one of the many faces in the crowd that was excited to meet some of the skeptic celebrities that were there. And we're very fortunate to have some of his time today. It's a Sunday afternoon. He does skepticism for a living, so he's really been gracious to give us some of his time. He's going to talk about conspiracy theories, including the psychology of conspiracies, types of conspiracies, the history of conspiracy theories, and much, much more. So Ben, if you're there, go ahead and join us.
I believe I'm here.
You're somewhere. Good deal.
That's what they want you to think anyway, right?
Thanks for joining us. So make sure you cover two things today. Who killed Jeffrey Epstein and who is really trying to kill us with coronavirus? Those two things we've got to cover.
I'll do my best. It's a broad topic. Thank you for inviting me, David. This is cool. If I seem a little out of kilter, bear with me. I've given many talks in my life, very few in front of a computer. Usually I do it standing up and all that, but I'll do my best to under the circumstances, right? We're all doing our best.
We will be very gracious, and we're grateful to have you with us, Ben. So no worries, take it away, and we'll round up some questions and get back to you when you're all set. So we'll talk to you in a minute.
So I'll be talking again, Conspiracies 101. I'll just preface this talk by saying that that conspiracy theories it's a broad, complex topic, and it's very difficult to sort of go into much more than just sort of a superficial overview. There's so many different aspects to it. It's very polarizing. So I'm sure that listeners and viewers will have some conspiracy in mind that I won't talk about because there's too many of them, but I may try and come back for a second one later on. So let's just take the word conspiracy theory. It's probably one of the most polarizing two-word nouns in the English language, because just conspiracy theory, it just evokes, these, drooling tinfoil-hatted crazy people spewing their wild theories here and there. But in many ways, as I'll talk about, that's sort of a misnomer. Because many people across the spectrum believe in conspiracy theories. They just believe in sort of different ones. And to some people, the phrase conspiracy theory is sort of a dismissive dodge, right? It's like, well, it's the truth. It's not a conspiracy theory. So oftentimes, the people that are promoting conspiracy theories are reluctant to formally call them that, even if they self-evidently are. Other people embrace conspiracy theories as sort of the countercultural version of telling the truth and putting it out there. And yeah, of course it's a conspiracy theory, but oftentimes it's sort of seen as this sort of snide, dismissive comment, and it's really not. It's more of an objective. I mean, that's really what they are. So let's begin at the beginning. So there's no universally accepted definition of conspiracy theory. It sort of goes across the spectrum, but in general, it's a proposed plot by a powerful person or organization working towards a goal, usually for some clandestine or hidden nefarious plot. You rarely hear conspiracy theories about good things. It's like, there's this conspiracy to do great in the world. Nobody talks about those. They talk about the conspiracies to impose a new world order, to poison people, to kill people, to do all sorts of horrible things. But that's sort of generally what we're talking about is groups of people trying to do something hidden, something subversive, and its effects and symptoms can be seen and are pointed out in alternative media, for example. I should point out as a caveat that I have been accused of being parts of various conspiracy theories over the years. I've been a researcher and writer for almost 20 years now, over 20 years. And in the course of all this, when I'm writing about, for example, UFOs or aliens, and I try and sort of put out the accurate information about, for example, what happened here in New Mexico, where I live, in Roswell, or if I debunk some UFO sighting, typically I get someone chiming in, well, what do you expect? It's a conspiracy theory, right? Same thing happens, for example, when I write about homeopathy or alternative medicine or something else for which there isn't good evidence. Immediately I'm branded as part of the conspiracy by big pharma. I'm still waiting for my big pharma checks. I've been accused of cashing shill bucks for 15 years. Still haven't gotten them. So maybe they're in the wrong account. I don't know why my shill bucks haven't showed up. If anybody out there is listening and can reach the people at the top, I'd appreciate if the conspiracy bucks would come in, because frankly, I could use them. And also, of course, another example would be when I write about disproven, for example, mass shooting conspiracies. And for example, there's been several. One of them is the Sandy Hook shooting, and I remember I wrote about how we know that many of the conspiracy theories about Sandy Hook weren't true at all. And I wrote up, I think, for Discovery News a while back. And within hours after that article was posted, I got hate emails from people. And to this day, I still get occasional hate mails and occasionally death threats, and occasionally from conspiracy people. And the reason is interesting, and this is what it is. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. But in the conspiracy mindset, there's this bipolar aspect to it. It's good or it's bad. It's binary. And so in the conspiracy mindset, either you're with us or you're with them. And if you're with them, that is, if you're with the conspiracy theorist and you embrace what they're talking about and their different theories and this and that, then you're out there fighting the good fight, trying to bring reality to the masses. On the other hand, if you're not with them, then you're in one of two camps. You're either the sheeple, right? The sheep that believe anything that comes across their feed. They believe anything the mainstream media tells them, and they're these largely fictional, other they people who are out there believing everything they're told. Or if you're not a sheeple, then that means that you're sort of a useful idiot, or you may not know all the details of the conspiracy, but you're working against them in some way. And oftentimes you're assumed to be malicious. You're assumed to be evil in this worldview. either you're on the side of right or you're on the side of wrong. And the side of right to them is the people that are trying to expose the truth and tell everybody what's really going on. And for these people, there's no gray area, and it's one or the other. And oftentimes, if you're not with them, if you're, for example, debunking conspiracies or trying to explain conspiracies from a folkloric point of view or psychology, whatever else, again, they'll quickly cast you as evil and as bad, and because again, that's their worldview. The idea is that you know the truth, or you know some glimmer of the truth, and you're actively trying to hide it. And this is one of the reasons why conspiracy theories are very difficult to refute, and also why they're often very damaging, is because they do provide this very binary us versus them, good versus evil view of the world. When in fact, there may be people, for example, like me, who are genuinely trying to explain why given conspiracy cannot be true. So if, for example, I'm debunking a conspiracy, it's not because I know what the truth is and I'm working with the government to try and keep everything hidden. I'm trying to explain to the average person why these theories don't hold water. And it's important to recognize that that when you talk about conspiracy theories, the name itself is a bit of a misnomer, because conspiracy theorists don't propose their own theories. You might think that a person who is a conspiracy theorist and putting out these ideas about what happened to JFK, or how we actually landed on the moon, or whatever else, would be putting forth theories, right? That's conspiracy theories, you would think, are putting out theories. In fact, they almost never do that. And this becomes apparent if you look at it a little more closely. Their goal is to poke holes, or try and poke holes, in the so-called official story. They're basically engaging what's called anomaly hunting. So they see some event in the news, often some politically charged event, and their immediate reaction is, well, this goes against my thoughts, this goes against the mainstream narrative, whatever else. And they begin looking for ways that they begin looking at what they consider to be the official story, which, as I'll talk about a bit later, is a bit of a fiction. And instead of actually proposing a theory, some sort of coherent, logical theory that fits the facts about what actually happened, they're content to say, well, we don't really know, but what about this? What about that? They go into these real or perceived holes in the story. This really came home to me about 10, 15 years ago. I was on a panel on conspiracies at DragonCon in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the day. And I was on a panel on conspiracies, and I was talking about it. And during the Q&A, somebody stood up, and I could tell immediately he was a conspiracy theorist. And he said, well, this is all interesting, but blah, blah, blah. And he says, well, I want to talk about 9/11. I'm like, okay. So he began going, and I had the mic, and I said, okay, we will listen to you. You have the mic, that's fine. No one's going to try and shut you down or censor you or else. Before you go on, let me just ask you, what do you think happened on 9/11? And he's like, well, I don't. I said he was sort of hedging. I said, you have the microphone, you have the entire audience's attention. You just got done talking about how the official story of 9/11 can't be true. So tell us, if you know what happened, tell us what happened. Tell us who did it, when did they do it, how did they do it? And it was this weird moment where, and I wasn't trying to turn this into a gotcha moment. It was just this weird moment where all of a sudden he realized that he had nothing. He was ready for a list. He was ready with his memorized list of, well, jet fuel can't melt this and this and that, and building 11. But when I asked them, when I turned the tables on him and said, okay, well, let's say all this is wrong. If the official story is totally bogus, Okay, well, you tell us what happened. Well, I don't know what happened. And so he began by saying, well, you have to look at motives. I said, no, we don't need to look at motives. I asked a very simple question. I'm being very honest here. What happened? And he finally admitted that he had no idea what happened in 9/11. And his goal wasn't to propose a theory that fit the facts or anything else. His goal was to raise these so-called anomalies or errors that he perceived. So let me talk for a bit about the evolution of the conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theories aren't new. So the building blocks of what makes conspiracy theory, certainly psychologically, they're not new. It includes distrust of authority, wanting inside information, and real or imagined persecution. So oftentimes in conspiracy theories, you see this theme of victimization. People feel like they're being victimized somehow, and the world isn't letting them have a fair shake, and they see these forces going on behind closed doors. And so the conspiracy theories at their heart are profoundly populist. It's the common man demanding a peek behind the curtains of power, saying, well, if we all rise together and demand to know the truth, and demand to know the truth about the UFO crash in Roswell, or Air 51, or aliens on the moon, what have you. And so there's this notion of victimization, and this notion that if only they were allowed access to what the cognoscenti know, that they themselves would be empowered and enriched. And so that's one of the reasons why why conspiracy theories are so compelling to people, is that it plays to the sense of fairness. It plays to the sense of justice. Oftentimes you hear the phrase, just asking questions. That's sort of the classic conspiracy thing. We're just asking questions. And that is an effective technique because, of course, who's against asking questions? I mean, asking questions is what people should do in life. That's nobody's against asking questions. That's fine. That's wonderful. That's what you should do. The problem is that oftentimes the questions they're asking have been answered. It's not that the conspiracy theorists are asking questions that those in charge are freaking out because we don't know how to answer those questions. Like, no, you ask a question. It's probably a legitimate question. Sometimes it's not, but oftentimes it is. And here's the answer. So the issue is not that conspiracy theorists aren't getting the answers. It's that they're not accepting the answers they're given. I'll give you one quick example. Just to go back to, for example, the Sandy Hook shooting, there was a conspiracy theory circulating around, including by Alex Jones, if I'm not mistaken, who latched on to, again, what they do anomaly hunting. They look for something that seems to them to be weird and try to latch onto this as being, well, this is evidence that this whole thing is staged or not true. And one of the pieces of evidence was that there was news footage of the parents of several of the victims in the high school in the school shooting that were coming out to meet reporters. They were coming out of a building and they were walking towards a podium to address reporters. And cameras caught them as they were coming out. And as they were coming out, I think there were 3 or 4 people, a couple of them were parents, and one of them smiled, another one laughed. And just sort of, they weren't rolling in the aisles. They just happened, there was a chuckle or something and they came out. And the conspiracy theorists jumped on this, like, wow, these are allegedly, the parents of these children that were killed. That's crazy. Why they're joking. No parent would ever smile after their child was killed in a school shooting. This must be proof. This must be evidence that the whole thing was fake, because of course no grieving parent would smile or laugh. This is literally one of the things they said, and it was just absurd. I mean, I have a degree in psychology, and anybody can tell you that people grieve in different ways. And just because one or more of the parents whose children were killed weeks earlier in the shooting, just because they happened to be joking or said some passing thing as they came through doors, and then came out to give a somber, discussion with the press and answer questions, doesn't mean anything. It literally means nothing. All it means is the people who thought that was weird, the conspiracy theorists that assume this is mysterious behavior and this is suspicious and that can't be true, it just means they know nothing about psychology. It means they know nothing about how real people act and grieve. So again, this is another example of something that we're just asking questions. Okay, your question was, why were these parents smiling or joking for a second before they came out to talk about the press? There's your answer. There's your answer. There's no, you can not accept that. You can think it's not true. You can do your own research on it, but you can't say that that question wasn't answered. Anyway, so it's interesting sort of look back at again, I got a lot to cover. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can, but I do want to touch on, again, the evolution of conspiracies, because it is interesting. So, for millennia, basically, there were no conspiracy theories. And that's because for most of human history, there was no access to independent information. Right? Conspiracy theories are based on independent information. They're based on information from one person that's contradicting another person. For example, a police detective or head of some government commission contrasted with Alex Jones or Donald Trump or whoever else. And they're saying, well, these two can't be right. But for most of human history, there was no independent information. Most of the information that people got was through the church. And there was no need to know about things outside their local community, because they were ranchers, they were farmers, they were fishermen. In the 1300s, 1400s, and so on, they didn't know about what was going on in distant lands, because most of them lived and died within maybe 20, 50 miles of where they were born, because there was no big world out there that they knew of. That changed with the establishment of religion in the church, in which all of a sudden you had information coming from religious leaders, and so you had people teaching and talking about, well, here are truths beyond your local community, because again, before that, what happened in other places to other people wasn't relevant. It was like their lives, the most exciting thing that happened in their life was, a cow got stuck in a fence or something. I mean, there was no fodder for conspiracies before that, and what it was going on really had no relevance outside that. And then that changed in the mid 1440s with of course, you had movable type, and you had Gutenberg, who then made books. And at the point in which there were books, there was, at that point, information was portable, and it was transportable, and also that meant that there were different viewpoints. So initially there was just the Bible, and here's the Bible, here's the revealed truth. Believe it, learn it, love it. This is the total truth. And then once other authors began publishing books and writing books, then suddenly you had different authors who had different points of view, possibly about different things. And suddenly you had two alleged authorities or experts who may be having differences of opinion about important things in the world. And of course, if you're a layperson and you have two experts that are disagreeing, then, I mean, with the Enlightenment, we realize that, of course, experts can disagree. Intelligent people can look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. That doesn't mean anybody's lying. It doesn't mean anybody's crazy. It doesn't mean there's any deception or cover-up. It just means that honest people can disagree. But it also means, of course, that the other way to interpret that is that, well, one of them is lying, right? We have these two experts. They say this, they say that. What are their motivations? Which one of them is lying? Which one, what are their, follow the money, what's going on here? And so that leads people to question. And of course, conspiracy theories also played an important role in witch persecution in the Middle Ages, for example, and also in Salem in the 1690s. So there's this interesting dynamic where conspiracy theory meets political opportunity, which is a common theme. And then in this case, for example, during the witch persecutions, and also including the ones in Salem, the concern was less the individual witches. Somebody who's accused of making a crop fail, or lightning striking something, or something bad happening, or a plague, or a drought, or whatever else. That was part of the concern, but the bigger concern was the conspiracy. The bigger concern was not that some one individual witch on the outside of town was doing something bad. The real concern was that there were a bunch of hidden witches in different communities that were getting together to fly off to midnight meetings and consort with the devil and conspire to do bad things. And so, with the concerns by the Catholic Church and others about witchcraft, part and parcel of that was conspiracy, because that was what they feared. They feared that there were all these devil worshippers, all these Satanists, all these witches and their familiars in different places, all plotting the evil overthrow of good moral people. So that's one dynamic. And then, of course, then we had modern technology, right? And so for many years, conspiracy theories were sort of word of mouth. It was just sort of people talking about rumors and what they suspected was going on. So again, some of it codified in text. For example, the Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches. You have these texts from not that long ago, unfortunately, that are explicitly laying out for lay people this alleged conspiracy of witches. And then you have, of course, modern technology, right? So then let's move up to, say, the 1940s and 50s. So for a long time, you only had the big three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And so I'm sure many people of a certain age will remember when that was all you had. There wasn't Fox News, there wasn't CNN, there wasn't all these other avenues. And so the information was limited to these three, and there was some dispute. I mean, for example, one reporter might see things a little bit differently. But then you had, with the advent of 24-hour news and CNN, suddenly you had multiple sources of news reporting the same story from, in many cases, different angles, and sometimes politically, ideologically different angles. And so news was being reported with one particular slant, and that fed into this notion that somebody's hiding something if they're talking about two different things. And so the so-called information boom has been a boon for conspiracy theorists, because all of a sudden, particularly with the internet, you have people who are able to connect with each other in ways they couldn't before. In the 1970s, for example, the main way that conspiracy theories circulated was through the mail. There were pamphlets and zines and sort of underground magazines that would be sent among conspiracy theorists across America and around the world. You'd have to, pay, $5 for a self-addressed stamped envelope, wait a couple weeks, and get some tract in the mail to sort of see what was going on in the world. But with the internet, suddenly, with a few clicks of a mouse, you've got access to all sorts of information out there. And of course, many different viewpoints. So the other, of course, the more recent twist is having high-profile conspiracy theorists gain mainstream acceptance. So, for example, the obvious example is Alex Jones, who has made millions of dollars promoting conspiracy theories. He's, of course, just one of many, and there are many out there. And he's among the most, in many ways, the most damaging, most influential. But you also have, and not to get political here, but you also have Donald Trump. I mean, by any measure, Trump has employed conspiracy theories for political gain more than any other president ever. Carter, Ford, Obama, Clinton. I mean, Trump has by far embraced and used conspiracy theories for his advantage in a way that had never been done before, certainly mainstream politics. You can go back and you look at his claims, for example, about Obama being born in Kenya or Indonesia. I guess, according to some people, he was born in 2 different places. I've never really got that, but again, so, and just last week, I mean, if I was writing something on Donald Trump conspiracies, I'd have to update it weekly because there's new ones every week. In fact, just a couple weeks back, there was a conspiracy that Trump was floating on Twitter about a journalist who had killed somebody. There's no evidence for it at all, but he was like, well, this is they say that. And so, again, this interesting when you sort of look at the broad perspective, going from basically there being no conspiracies, you have people that are primed for conspiracies, but no conspiracies as such, to conspiracies being promoted in the highest office in the land, and that's damaging for reasons I'll get into in a second. But let me sort of shift gears for a second from the history of conspiracy theories to conspiracy thinking and the psychology of conspiracies. So when you talk about the psychology of conspiracy theories, there's a couple different things going on here. Basically, there's different dynamics, but some of the common themes are that there's no such thing as incompetence or misunderstandings or errors. The conspiracy theorists, again, part of what they do is they search the so-called official story, whatever that may be. Maybe it's an official government report, such as in 9/11. Maybe it's news coverage of a shooting or something going on, and they'll comb through these and they'll find discrepancies. They'll say, well, hold on here, this can't be right, because there was this mass shooting and this reporter said this, but another reporter 2 days later said something else. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is called journalism. News reporters don't get everything right. Especially in the hours and days, in some cases weeks, after a high-profile event such as 9/11 or a school shooting or mass shooting or whatever else, there will inevitably be contradictions. There will be a reporter that got something wrong. There will be an eyewitness that misspoke. There will be any number of things where somebody gets it wrong, they correct it later on, and everybody moves on. But the conspiracy mindset combs through these, in some cases, dozens or hundreds of hours of things. They're looking for well, hold on, these can't both be right. What's going on here? This is suspicious. Is somebody lying? No, not necessarily. I mean, sometimes people lie, but the mere fact that you have identified one or more or even dozens of errors and mistakes and discrepancies between eyewitnesses or between different news media covering the same thing means nothing. It just means that you don't have a good grasp of media literacy is what that means. But again, they latch onto these things and they see them as signs of something more important going on. So they see these little, oh, the mistake here, mistake there, and they see this as part of a bigger pattern. And this gets back to the psychology, right? Because the human mind is it's sort of geared towards conspiracy thinking, because we see patterns in the world. That's one reason, for example, we see faces in clouds, or we see patterns in stains. People see the zodiac, right? People say, oh, well, here's the archer, here's the scales, here's this and here's that. Those aren't literally there. You can connect those dots to make those zodiac signs and symbols, but they're not actually there. That's us filling it in. And the same process happens with conspiracy theories. People will sort of connect these dots in a certain way that aligns with their ideology and aligns with what they want to think. And then they'll say, well, what about this? This is suspicious. And so basically their argument is, as I mentioned, it's not one of promoting any given specific falsifiable conspiracy or even conspiracy theory. It's more about finding the gaps, finding the so-called mistakes, the errors, and saying, well, isn't this suspicious? Let's pull these things together. So there are five main personality characteristics that have been identified as being related to conspiracy thinking. They're not universal, but these are overall tendencies. One of them is low interpersonal trust. So conspiracy theorists tend to have, they tend to distrust other people, loved ones, friends, family, you take your pick. Now, of course, you know, part of this is that there's a plausibility, right? Because I mean, look, I'm a skeptic. That's I do investigative skepticism. Part of my job is telling people to not believe everything you see. So I totally agree with that. I totally agree that we can't believe everything we see. We have to apply critical thinking and empirical investigation to claims across the board, whether it's claims about, you know, political claims or advertising claims or ghosts or anything weird. I'm all about not believing everything you hear. Absolutely. We're on the same page with this. But that's not the same thing as distrusting things implicitly about what's going on around you. The second one that you find is acceptance of unusual beliefs or related beliefs. So, for example, with conspiracy theorists, you find that there's a cluster of beliefs. They don't just believe in one conspiracy theory; they believe in many cases dozens of them. And so it's not there's one specific thing they think is true that everybody's saying is false, or the mainstream media is saying is false. It's that they have, again, 3, 4, 5, a dozen or more other conspiracies that they think are somehow linked in some way. They can't necessarily explain why. They're suspicious there's something going on. Another one is paranoia. And again, this isn't necessarily clinical paranoia. I mean, so there's clinical paranoia, and there's sort of an underlying sort of lowercase p paranoia in which people are believing that that people are out to get them. They're being, again, this goes back to the feelings of victimization, and that's another one of the factors is feelings of victimization, that they are being put upon, they're being misled, they're being manipulated in some way for other people's benefit. And then the last one is feelings of political or social or personal isolation and alienation. So they tend to feel isolated from other people. That doesn't mean they don't have friends. It's just that they just, and oftentimes, of course, in the conspiracy world, they find each other, right? That's why there's whole groups. That's why there's audiences for Alex Jones and whatnot. So they find each other, but even within that community, they often feel alienated. They feel like that no one really quite understands things the way that they do. So that's sort of some backgrounds on the personality characteristics. And there are a couple more specific facets to this. One of them is logical errors. And again, this is not unique to conspiracy theorists. We all make logical errors, every single one of us. Everybody listening and watching, including myself, has probably made some logical error at some point since they woke up today. It's very common. It's inherent in human nature. There's nothing wrong with that. But in the case of conspiracy theorists, they tend to sort of latch on to these often self-evident logical fallacies. I'll give you one quick example. For example, going to 9/11, one of the common refrains you hear is, well, you know, this the official story can't be right because jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams. The idea being that when the planes crashed into the Twin Towers, which were loaded with jet fuel, of course, that the jet fuel burning wasn't hot enough to melt the interior structure to have the things come down, and therefore it must have been explosive charges placed there before the time. Well, you know, take your pick. The problem here is that jet fuel doesn't need to melt steel beams for the building to collapse. So it's technically true that jet fuel does not burn hot enough to melt steel beams. You don't need to melt steel beams to have the structure come down. All you need to do is weaken them enough. And jet fuel does burn hot enough to weaken steel. This is well known. This is not this is not a conspiracy. These are known facts put out by material scientists and engineers. So again, this notion that, well, gotcha believers, gotcha skeptics. Like, no, you didn't get anything. You misunderstood what the claims are, and you misunderstood how structural engineering works. No one ever said that the steel beams were reduced to water or liquid. No one ever said that. They just need to be weak enough to have the weight come down, which is a different matter entirely. So let's see, I've got, by my count, I've got another 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to try and sort of hit on a couple other topics. And then there may or may not be time for Q&A. So as I said, one of the common themes in the psychology of conspiracy theorists, as I mentioned, is this binary thinking, this us versus them, the believers versus or the sheeple versus the people in the know. And there's also the, as I touched on before, there's also this binary thinking, this binary fallacy of the so-called official story. And I touched on that a second ago, where they latch on to an official story and they say, well, the official story is wrong. And they'll point to some statement made by some official, or they'll point to coverage in the Boston Globe or the New York Times, or wherever else, not recognizing that in many cases, there isn't an official story. There are, particularly with news reports, there are many different stories. And no one ever said this is the capital T truth. These are different reporters from different organizations reporting in different parts of the story. And yes, inevitably, there may be discrepancies. Someone may got something wrong. An eyewitness may have forgotten something or gotten it wrong or lying, or who knows. But just because you found some discrepancy doesn't mean anything. And part of the reason that conspiracy theories can be so compelling to people is that it provides them with a sense of security. And this is weird because the security they feel is knowing that somebody is in control. Some entity out there, that even if it's nefarious, even if they're afraid of it, there's this level of comfort in knowing that however crazy things get, however weird things are going to be okay, because somebody, or the Illuminati or the reptilians or the Bilderbergs or Hillary Clinton, whoever it is, somebody is behind this and is pulling the strings. And so it's not so much that they agree with it, of course, because they're fighting against it, but it gives them a sense that there's a meaning to the world, and it is a reaction against fear of basically random chance. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea that the world is random and random things happen. As I said before, in the conspiracy mindset, nothing is random, or very little is random. It's all part of some plan. So if you just connect the dots in the right way, you'll see that this is really the case. And for a lot of people, they're frightened by that. They're frightened by this notion that maybe the world really is not governed by gods or conspiracies or hidden groups, that the world really is just random and things happen, and they happen to good people and they happen to bad people. And oftentimes the conspiracies they're put forth, as I mentioned before, with people by a particular social or political agenda. So oftentimes you'll see people who will endorse some conspiracy theory, and it's not necessarily because that they literally believe it. And like, for example, there's been several polls that have suggested that when they've asked people back during Obama's presidency, do you think Obama is the Antichrist? And the evidence for Obama being the Antichrist is pretty thin. Let's just be honest, objectively. But a significant number of people answered yes, including some Democrats. Which, anyway, they said, yes, I believe Obama's the Antichrist. They tell this to a poll or a surveyor. And it's important to realize that you can't take these sorts of questions at face value, because oftentimes they're endorsing a conspiracy theory not based on any actual literal personal worldview, but on a set of beliefs, a political agenda. So if you sit them down and say, really, I mean, do you honestly deep down believe that Obama is the Antichrist as written about in the Bible and the whole, end times? They're like, well, no, probably not really. But they're like, but still, I don't like him. So if somebody asks me, I'm going to say he's the Antichrist. He's this and that. And this is one of the patterns you see both among conspiracies, both right and left. There's left-wing conspiracies, there's right-wing conspiracies. So it really crosses the political spectrum. But oftentimes when people endorse conspiracy theories, it doesn't necessarily mean they literally endorse them. It just means that they generally agree with what's going on. It's the same thing that happens on social media when you've got people who will like and share articles they haven't read based on the headline. They just, they haven't read the whole thing. They read the first couple words, like, share, and go on. They're not literally endorsing what the article said because they haven't read the article. They're endorsing, you might call it virtue signaling. They're endorsing this thing based on nothing more than, well, I generally know what they're trying to say, and yes, I agree with that. That doesn't mean they actually agree with the details on that. And let me just wrap up by talking about a couple reasons why they continue. One is that you have credentialed believers. So, for example, you do have experts who will come out and say, yes, this conspiracy thing is true, and the conspiracy theorists will latch onto that. So, for example, you have astronaut Edgar Mitchell, for example, an astronaut, an actual real-life astronaut, has said that he believes that the U.S. government is hiding aliens, alien spacecraft. So to a lot of people, well, he's an astronaut. He's Edgar Mitchell. I didn't walk on the moon. He would know. You also see this, for example, with anti-vaccination and COVID-19. There was the recent video that came out called Plandemic about a month ago. And they had a former virologist, Dr. Judy Mikovits, who wrote a book, and the book had a foreword, I think, by Robert F. Kennedy, the Robert F. Kennedy, anti-vaxxer. So they have these names attached to their conspiracy theories, and that gives them legitimacy. So let me just wrap up by saying about some of the good news. I've talked about the history. I've talked about different conspiracies. I've talked about the psychology behind them. So there's a little bit of good news here. One of them is that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, fewer people believe the extremes than is widely assumed. So you can look at some polls and surveys and say, well, the world is crazy. People believe these crazy things. Yes and no. Again, as I mentioned with the Obama being the Antichrist poll results, it doesn't necessarily mean that's literally true. It's still concerning, but people should take some heart that that many of the conspiracies that are super wacko, the reptilians and this and that, they're really genuinely believed by a relatively small number of people. And the second good news is that in many cases, people can make their way out of conspiracy theories. A friend of mine, Mick West, who runs a website called Metabunk, he wrote a book, came out a year or two back, called Escaping the Rabbit Hole. I highly recommend it if people are interested in real life case studies of people who were into conspiracy theories and managed to get themselves out of it, oftentimes with help and different techniques. So anyway, I'm about out of time. That sort of concludes my Conspiracies 101. At some point, I may do a deeper dive into some of these other ones. And again, if you want more information on how to help people get out of conspiracies, I can recommend a couple books, including Escaping the Rabbit Hole from Mick West. Brian Dunning's done a book on conspiracies, the title is escaping me at the moment. Sorry, Brian. And also books by Usinski, Ucinski. I think they did a book called American Conspiracy Theories. So all excellent resources, and I hope this is useful.
Yeah, fantastic. Appreciate that very much. So a lot of content there. And as with any 101 course, it needs to last a whole semester and you cover a lot of ground. So
Exactly.
We couldn't do all of that, but we definitely do have time for Q&A, and we're going to allow you to help us terminate that when you get tired of us, because again, I want to respect your Sunday afternoon, but I know you want to get to a few questions here, and they just started kind of piling in. So folks, if you want to ask a question, we've got a good pile there now, but if you have a real good one that we check out before we finish up, we'll definitely throw that in. And if we don't get to your question, I apologize, but I have been taking notes on all the questions that have come in. had plenty of my own, but you guys are going to be able to trump those by having some of your own. I just wanted to point out a couple of things that struck me as you were talking. So the intranet seems to provide us a way to not only get a lot of good information, and we're going to talk about in 2 weeks how Wikipedia is getting better in some of those ways with Susan Gerbic and her project. But it seems to me, and here's this idea, I've thrown it out a few times, see what you think of it. People can share bullshit they don't even understand right now and make people think they believe it. And as the example you gave with the 9/11 truther that was asking you questions, this person probably didn't have their own theory, but not only that, they probably just read somebody else's doubts and questions and didn't even probably fully understand those. But as with all talking points, I mean, it's so easy to share those and not even fully understand them. Is there something to that? I mean, is that pretty common nowadays? And was that present before the 90s and the intranet?
No, that's a great question. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the deep ironies, is that oftentimes the conspiracy theorists that I come across, the ones that challenge me on something or whatever else, and they're like, well, you need to think independently. And they'll regurgitate verbatim a meme they saw, and they clearly haven't thought about it at all. They're like, well, it's so important to do individual research. Like, and did you do any actual research? Or did you just cut and paste these bullet points? It's just, and they just don't. It's this weird sort of, they think that they think that critical thinking applies to what other people should be doing and not what they should be doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely true in that again, before the age of the internet, information certainly circulated, but it wasn't as splintered as it is now. Mm-hmm. And there wasn't as much incentive to promote it. There were people who had wild ideas about anything and everything, but there wasn't this corporatized, monetized algorithms that are trying to promote these things, right? And so this isn't of course unique to conspiracies. You see it's the same thing with clickbait headlines. Mm-hmm. and wild theories and this and that, is that on Facebook and Twitter and elsewhere, algorithms are promoting the wildest, most exaggerated, craziest stories because that's what people want to read. They want to get excited. They want to get outraged and this and that. And so that's part of the problem. Is it's not just the people that are promoting them, it's the social media itself that is oftentimes they're not doing it maliciously. I mean, they're doing it because, again, clicks get money, and I mean, there's no mystery to it. It's not that Zuckerberg or anybody else is intentionally trying to promote conspiracies. They're just trying to make money. And unfortunately, one way to do that is to share and spread these around. And fortunately, in the past few months, there has been some, as I'm sure you know, and many listeners know, there has been some efforts made to stamp out the explicitly the grave, the obvious misinformation. They're still letting 98% of it go by, but they have, due in part to pressure from elected officials and users who are just genuinely concerned about the effect this is having on public discourse, in which information is just being bandied about, and that's your opinion, dude. Yeah. And so fortunately they have been making some baby steps towards curbing that, but it's really spitting in the wind.
Yeah. So yeah, we've seen an evolution of religion towards everyone's right, or the New Age philosophy of everyone has their own truth, and that just does a lot of damage to the facts and the realities that we should be dealing with. So here's a question. So in this, you may have touched on this as I was taking notes and chatting with folks. I hope I didn't miss anything, but this one seems like an obvious one, and I know this one we've talked about before. Are there beliefs that were widely regarded as conspiracy theories that later turned out to be true?
Yeah, absolutely. If I had 2 hours to give this talk, there's a longer version of this talk. Yeah. So that's part of the thing I didn't touch on. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, conspiracy theories do exist. Absolutely. They're pretty widely known. 9/11 was a conspiracy. There's no doubt about it. There were There were people that were plotting to take down the Twin Towers and to hijack the planes, and that was literally a conspiracy. And it was executed, and it all happened. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the Bush administration knew about it. It just means that, yeah, there were people working to do these things. Conspiracies happen all the time. There's conspiracy to commit murder. There's conspiracy to trade in drugs. There's been numerous actual legitimate corporate conspiracies. General Motors, for example, among others, just a few years back, they were subjected to a huge fine, I think $900 million, for hiding faulty ignition systems. And they admitted in court documents that they knew about the systems and covered it up. General Motors did that. This is not my speculation. This is well established. And in these cases, for example, the General Motors ignition issue, this isn't abstract. I mean, and I'm not bagging on General Motors here. I'm just using it as one example. The General Motors conspiracy literally cost people's lives. This isn't abstract. This isn't, oh, with cute little thing, you know, Paul is dead, whatever else. This actually killed people. But these sorts of conspiracies are usually ignored by the conspiracy theorists because they're not sexy. They're like, well, okay, there's the real conspiracies, but let's talk about the crazy ones. Let's talk about, you know, man didn't land on the moon. Let's talk about the big pharma, you know, anti-vax ones. And so that's part of the answer to your question, is that absolutely conspiracies exist. And you know, that's well documented. And of course, there are some things that in these cases, of course, later turned out to be true. So at one point, these known conspiracies were just that. They were, you know, rumored, talked about, known only by a small cadre of people who are literally keeping it from regulators, from the public, from other people, and these later turned out to be true. So that's part of the answer. If you look at Brian Dunning's book, and again, the title is escaping me at the moment. He has a section on conspiracies that later turned out to be true, and they are of a different kind than the typical, you know, false flag Alex Jones type conspiracy. Was
this conspiracies declassified? I just did a quick search.
Yes, that's right.
It. Okay, yeah, he's got a few out there. It looks like that one's the one that popped up. Yeah. So the term, I don't hear a lot of people saying, "Here's my conspiracy theory." I hear them saying, "Here's my theory." So,
right.
So it's kind of telling. One thing I do want to point out, I'm talking about conspiracy theories. We didn't talk about flat Earth, but there's a good movie, Behind the Curve, that came out last year, which really shows at the very end. And if you wait for it, you'll be glad you did. Kind of the thinking that goes into defending the conspiracy that has no value, or that has no ending point, right? And we talk about this whether we're talking about religion or other things. Is there's so much that you can push out in the way of the fight against the, you know, the debunking process, that there's always something that they can do. So it's like this moving target of ideas, and I think you mentioned that in kind of a different
right.
way. Yeah.
No, I'm glad you mentioned Behind the Curve, because that's an excellent example. I did see the doc. It's really interesting. There's a couple of just really golden points in it. And so they're, you know, most conspiracies are difficult or impossible to fully refute, because of course any information that you offer debunking it is itself called part of the conspiracy, mm-hmm. right? So they have this sort of self-reinforcing closed system worldview. And they say, well, give us information. You know, we're just asking questions. And when you provide them with the answers, well, that too is faked. Well, you know, you would say that, but this and that and the other. And it just sort of had this snowballing effect.
Yeah.
But, you know, there are conspiracies that have been, you know, essentially, well, entirely debunked. Like one quick example is the Paul is dead conspiracy. This is the Paul McCartney, you know, died. And if you look at the album covers, you know, on Abbey Road and elsewhere, Sgt. Pepper's, that there are all these hidden signs that people see. Well, if you look here, this means, you know, if there's a hand over his head in this religion, it means he's dead, and he's out of step walking across Abbey Road. And again, this is one of the sort of pop culture like conspiracies, but McCartney is pretty clearly alive. I mean, I saw him perform. He's still kicking. And then you have these other conspiracies that would seem to have been falsified. So, for example, one of the common ones, of course, when you ask people, what's the motivation? Why you provided this? Well, you haven't provided any theory at all. You've provided this laundry list of things that you think is wrong with the official story. So that if you ask them, okay, well, what's the goal here? And depending on the conspiracy, of course, they'll say, well, glad you asked that. The answer is these are false flag events that are the whole purpose. For example, with conspiracies surrounding mass shootings, for example, or school shootings, the claim is that, well, the goal is to give the government a reason to take over everybody's guns. And you say, okay, how's that worked out? Because that still hasn't happened. There's been at least a dozen cases that I can think off the top of my head that were claimed to have been carefully orchestrated, and all these actors and false flag and all these sort of things, and all that was for the goal of taking away America's guns and repealing the amendment, and yet that didn't happen. So why is that? Mm-hmm. And they don't have an answer.
So I'm going to put a couple of questions together that came in around the same ideas. So there's some conspiracy theories that I've noticed that are very partisan in nature, and some that aren't. And if you could talk about kind of the partisan nature as well as age, the demographics of age, and how that relates to maybe some conspiracy theories. Of course, we're exposed to different things based on how old we are and who we hang out with because of the bubbles and the echo chambers we're built into. But talk about the partisan nature and the age demographics of some of the theories, if any come to mind.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, it's the idea that conspiracy theorists are all these drooling, wild-eyed, tinfoil-hatted lunatics is false. There are a couple that some of this is true, but for the most part, conspiracy theories are embraced by a surprisingly large number of people across the political spectrum. Liberals, conservatives, libertarians, everybody believes, most people believe in some form of conspiracy theory. I'll just give you one. So the ones on the right tend to be more prominent, partly because they're called out by the news media. Now, of course, the people on the right could say, well, that's because they're all liberal biased and they're trying to, make them look bad. Well, no, they're not trying to make them look bad. It's just that the right wing seems to be cranking these conspiracies out, and wherever they came from, in many cases among the right wing and conservatives, they're not true. And there's countless examples of that. I talked about one a minute ago with Trump. There's also the infamous Pizzagate story, where there was this conspiracy circulating that an associate of Hillary Clinton's had a child sex ring in the basement of this pizza place, like Pong or something, and in DC, and somebody believed this and went in with a gun trying to liberate the children. And turns out there is no basement in the building, and the whole thing was totally made up. But again, it's part of the reason is it's fueled by the agendas. It's fueled by people who are trying to promote this for a political agenda. Mm-hmm. And so to them, whether it's true or not is kind of irrelevant. It's not, their goal is to do something that will in some small way tarnish or make somebody look bad, make Clinton look bad, make Trump look bad, whatever else. And so the literal truth of it is in many times sort of secondary. That's they're using it as a vehicle for social protest. And I also see this, for example, again with many of my liberal friends. It was interesting a couple months back. I saw people sharing on Facebook this meme that was talking about how the U.S. government is trying to keep education down. Basically the idea was that that the government doesn't want educated people, So it's, that clearly, that the government is doing the best they can to keep people dumb, and so they'll easily led, and they will vote however you want. And I actually wrote an article for Skeptical Inquirer magazine about this. Came out a couple issues back, and I think it was titled "Is America a Sheeple Factory?" And I looked into it, and I said, this doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, I understand the motivation. The motivation is that people are pissed off about the state of the country. They're pissed off about the state of race relations. They're pissed off about the state of education. There's a laundry list of things that Americans are pissed off about, in many cases justifiably. But that doesn't mean that there was some concerted conspiracy, high-level attempt or motivation to do this. And in fact, if you look at it, the U.S. government has spent lots of money on education. There's government grants. There's we have free schooling through primary school and high school across the country. So I mean, we can all complain that the U.S. government should be doing more about education. We can all agree with that. But the idea that the government, again, this is across platforms, right? This is the conspiracy that was presented to me also occurred under Clinton and Obama, and this goes back decades. This alleged conspiracy by the U.S. government to keep people dumb, and I'm like, this literally doesn't make any sense at all. They may not be doing as much as you would like them to promote higher education, but that doesn't mean that anybody's trying to do this. So that's just one example of a literal conspiracy that go across the area. Yeah. And just sort of, the other part was talking about the age demographics. Mm-hmm. It tends to be the case that younger people do tend to believe in more conspiracies, and that's partly because they tend to be, as you might expect, more engaged in social media, which itself is largely a vehicle for conspiracy theories. So you have people in their 70s and 80s who, they're having trouble, using their phone, and I'm not making fun of that. I mean, my mother's one of them. It's just, it's high technology and, cell phones and apps and all that. So they're sort of locked into the information they were getting about conspiracies. So back when they were engaged, right? So this is people being engaged about, the JFK assassination and things like that. And so in many cases, the older generation isn't going to be exercised about the latest mass shooting, for example, that Alex Jones is putting out there, simply because that's not their demographic. That's not something that's going to be necessarily agitating them.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. So, and you were talking about education, and I get a sense of that as well. And I do feel like I've heard that the government is trying to keep people dumb, and that's that motivation that you're attributing is very different than the actual. And it could be the result of the actions they're taking, but it doesn't mean that's the motivation either, right? So whether we're trying to promote voucher programs and private schools is not the same thing as saying we need to keep the common folk dumb. It's just prioritizing things in a way that makes it look like that's the case. So I think that makes a lot of sense, to be skeptical of our own theories of what we believe are the motivators here. So, and I was wondering how you would relate to the young person question. And I think that when we have younger people, they tend to be affected by being in an authoritarian type environment, whether that's in school, whether that's in home. And I think there's certainly an evolution. I've read that there's an evolutionary benefit to believing what you're told, so that you're not, that you're not killed by the thing that you were warned about, right? So I think belief is definitely favored evolutionarily, and that might tie to younger people, believing what other people say, and perhaps not, because I think a lot of kids are known for not believing what their parents say. But I don't want to get into parenting 101 here. This is conspiracy theory. So
right. Well, just keep in mind. I mean, one other point I want to make is that again, part of the reason that conspiracy theories are plausible to many people is they tap into legitimate grievances, right? Everybody agrees that the educational system in America, if not broken, needs assistance. Right. I mean, I don't know anybody who would disagree with that, except maybe this education secretary. But I mean, so there's any number of problems in the world that we can point to and say, well, this is bad and it should be better. And the answer is, yeah, you're right. But just because it's bad doesn't mean that some shadowy group of people are pulling strings to make it bad for their own benefit. It just means that this is the state of the world, and you can only do so much, and there's limitations here.
Yep.
And so there, as I mentioned before, there's these built-in aspects that we all agree on. We all agree that questions are good, right? Yes, question. I'm just asking questions. The reason that's so resonant, as I mentioned, is because we all agree with it. Yeah, everybody should have the right to have their their questions answered. There's the distrust of the government. Yeah, well, everybody agrees, as far as I know, that the government lies to us sometimes. Kind of well known. This is not a state secret. The government sometimes lies. They cover things up. That doesn't mean that the conspiracies are true. It just means that that's one of the motivators. And so, because you're always going to have a population that does, on some level, distrust the government, that does, on some level, trust this and that and the other, there's always going to be this fertile ground across generations. For people who are promoting these stories.
Yeah, for sure. So the QAnon conspiracy theory organization, or whatever you want to call it, can you maybe touch on that for just a second? I certainly don't expect you to go through a list of conspiracy theories, but QAnon came up, and I think that's something people ought to know about.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't done a whole lot of QAnon. I mean, I know of it. I don't really feel an expert on that particular. I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole just because that's sort of outside my expertise. Except insofar as I mentioned, it goes back to the political motivations and the ease with which people will accept and share conspiracies that they may not genuinely agree with, but it in some ways promotes their overview of that and their agenda. So I'm not trying to duck the question. I don't feel conversant enough in QAnon specifically to go into it.
No problem at all. And so before we go, I want to make sure we talk about a couple of books again. So if you could be jotting things down between your thoughts there, and that question's going to come up, and also kind of where you folks need to go to follow you and support the organizations you support. But let's talk for just a minute, toolkit wise, right? How can we as scientific skeptics, as humanists, as non-religious people, as progressives in general on these issues around human rights and other things, when we talk about these subjects, with that, as your audience, what kind of tools would you say we should be using to combat this? What kind of conversations should we be having or not having? When somebody says, here's the bullshit I believe, what do we say back, and how do we do it?
Right. No, that's a great question. And I mean, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet here. As with many of these cases, it's a complex problem, and it's because it's rooted in different places. It's hard to root out, right? Because you have political motivations, you have psychological issues, you have the different personality types, you have these sort of things. So addressing any one of those is not going to root out conspiracy theories. That being said, as I mentioned, there are a couple things that we can do. One is media literacy and critical thinking. And I have advocated that for 20 years, as has the Center for Inquiry, of course, and others as well in the skeptical community. And the goal there, again, it's to promote people thinking critically about claims across the board. Political claims, advertising claims, conspiracy claims, weird claims. Whatever the claim is, if you're going to incorporate that into your belief system, if you're going to act on it, if you're going to say, I believe this information you're telling me, and I'm going to act on it in some way to conform to that, then it's vital that you have a screen. It's vital that you be able to filter in some way the stuff that's plausible from the stuff that's not. And that's not to say that people who engage in critical thinking or take critical thinking courses or whatever else are going to be immune to conspiracies, because that's not the case. But it is one added bit in the toolkit to apply these things across the board. And in Mick West's book, for example, he talks about this. And one of the techniques that's useful is he talks about a wedge technique. And the idea is to engage with the conspiracy believers to the extent that you're comfortable with. Now, this is a bit tricky, right? Because as somebody who is engaged in some cases at length with conspiracy theorists who, you know, on and this and that, and it's this rabbit hole and this gish gallop of, you know, I said this and then suddenly we're on here, and by the time you're trying to explain it, they're somewhere else. But if you can, again, it goes back to understanding the personality types. The personality types include a sense of alienation and a sense of victimization. And so if you can address that in your response, that helps to get them to open up to information that may contradict their conspiracies. Mm-hmm. So for example, Mick talks about talking to somebody who believed in a conspiracy. I've forgotten which one off the top of my head. And he said, okay, well, you believe in this, so do you also believe this other thing here? And the person said, well, no, I don't believe that. And as I mentioned, one of the personality characteristics of conspiracy theorists is they have a cluster of beliefs. It's not just one thing. They often believe in 3 or 4 or 5 dozen related things. And so if you can talk to them and listen to what they're saying and engage in them earnestly, and say, okay, well, you believe this, but do you also believe this? And then they say, well, I don't believe that one. That, you know, I believe this. That one's kind of silly. You say, okay, well, we can take that peg away. You believe these things. You don't believe this thing. What about this thing over here? Well, I kind of believe that. Yeah, but the same basis of what you just said you didn't believe here. So what's the difference? And if you engage constructively and respectfully and diplomatically, in many cases, you can bit by bit get them escaping the rabbit hole, as they say. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a difficult process, and it doesn't always work, and it depends on the person. There's lots of different circumstances, but that's one technique that you can use. And I'll just give you one quick example. A month or 2 back, there was a conspiracy theory that circulated on Facebook. One, you're thinking, only one? There's one particular one that caught my eye. And it was by a person I know on Facebook, and he was questioning whether or not, it was during the COVID, we're still in the COVID pandemic, but the question was, why is it that, the question was about whether hospitals are either overrun with patients or they're closing down because of they don't have enough money in patients. And I saw his post, and it was this sort of, it wasn't overtly conspiracy theory, but it was leaning pretty strong there. And he said, well, how would I go about investigating whether or not whether or not either the hospital is overwhelmed in the ICU with COVID patients, or they're shutting down because there's nobody in there? And I responded, diplomatically, respectfully. I said, okay, you know, I mean, I could have just blocked him. I could have just said, this is crazy. This is stupid. Who believes this bullshit? Or the technique that I took was to say, okay, I will, you know, I'm not going to spend days and weeks on this, but I'll spend a few minutes to engage in, you asked a fair question. And I responded. I said, you know, well, it's not either or. You know, it's not like the whole hospital is riddled with COVID, or, you know, or they're shutting down because no one's there. And I explained the different things about why some of the hospitals are shutting down, because the elective surgeries, which pays for most of the hospital. Anyway, I explained through it, and I engaged as much as I felt comfortable in trying to, again, not shut down, not ridicule, but to sort of say, okay, well, you asked this question, and I was cognizant of the fact that other people were probably also asking that question, mm-hmm. right? I mean, he put the post up there, but there's probably dozens, hundreds, I don't know, of people that saw that exchange, and whether or not he himself bought my discussion and my analysis of it, other people saw that. Other people saw the response again. So it was I'm just asking questions, and my response, you are just asking questions. Here's the answer. And so again, I obviously, there's no way to measure whether or not that helped, but my sense is that it did.
Well, and I think what we've learned in the last few years, particularly when this question comes up, the data points to acknowledging the concern, agreeing with their motivation, sympathizing with the value that they bring, and getting them kind of understanding that you're supporting their quest for information, and then helping them come to the conclusion, as opposed to saying you're wrong and here's why, or you're stupid and here's why, or delete block. So the reason to have the conversation, you touched on something, and I want to make sure everybody hears this, is it's not just to get better at having a conversation. It's not just to learn the other motivations that these people have. It's not just to educate yourself and to do a better job of communicating, but to set an example for how to have those conversations that's respectful, and so that scientific skeptics look like reasonable people, as opposed to just people who are just done and forget about it, right? It's not just debunking, it's having conversations and learning. And the more you understand these paranormal ideas and the conspiracies that are out there, the better you can, have a conversation around it, see why their faulty thinking is faulty, and help them understand it better. So there's a lot of good reasons to engage in it. It's just like you said, we don't have the time to straighten everyone's ideas out, but we should do it certainly for the people that we know best. And I think that's the best shot we have, is the people we know best. We're more likely to be able to convince them of right-minded thinking and reasoning with them.
Absolutely. So, I could not agree more.
So, and I want to point out, as I did before, that the Center for Inquiry has a great page on coronavirus. Certainly not a medical provider or outlet like some of those out there, but it does talk about some of the problem information and good information. Go to centerforinquiry.org/coronavirus. Have you had any input in that, or has that been somebody else's project?
Actually, since you asked, I actually played a role in setting that up. What happened was that in the first stages of the pandemic, I had begun writing pieces on conspiracy theories, because of course that's part of my interest anyway, is folklore and conspiracies and critical thinking and this and that. And so pretty early on, I was already sort of trying to address and debunk where I could some of the misinformation about COVID, which, I mean, we're talking about a deadly disease. I mean, you can say that some of the conspiracies are wacky or silly, whatever else, but I mean, the misinformation about a deadly disease can literally be life or death and fatal. So it was important for me to, where I could, to try and bring critical thinking to it. And then I was contacted by the CEO, Robin Bloomer, and Barry Carr, and I worked with other great people there, Paul Fidalgo, Mark Creedler, and others, and Bill London, a doctor. We had this idea to, why not go ahead and collect the information that I was writing and other people writing, and also have a given designated resource page that would be specifically dedicated to COVID accurate information. Not that there weren't other places, but this was a place under the CFI brand that could try and bring a skeptical science-based perspective to it.
Great. Well, thank you for doing that, and for all the other things. So before we finish up, somebody has asked about books again. So if any come to mind, I'll give you a chance to talk about that. Books you recommend.
Sure.
The one that I recommend as a scientific skeptic, and I know you have others, this is the one that I fell in love with several years ago, is one of Radford's books. So definitely take a look at that. Scientific Paranormal Investigation, is certainly scientific skepticism is kind of the root of my activism. And I would encourage people who are interested in bumps in the night types of claims to take a look at that and as well. And I wore my ironic Bigfoot shirt for you. I don't always have an opportunity to wear that, because if I don't wear it around the right crowd, then people might, think different things about me. But so talk about books, if you could, and then we'll talk about kind of where folks need to go to support you and the work you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I've written a dozen books at this point. Scientific Paranormal Investigation, the one you mentioned, is I think it was 2010. I've done books on mass hysterias. I did a book called Media Mythmakers, How Journalists, Activists, and Advertisers Mislead Us, which is very media literacy. I did a book on chupacabras, did a book on evil clowns. So I try to go across the spectrum.
A whole book.
Yeah, so it's just, but the common thread is weird things and how to think about them. So right. It may seem disparate, but in my mind, it's all part of the same thing. So, but yeah, I've been working on that, and I actually just recently finished a book that I'm shopping around on the role of fear in American politics, and how that manifests itself, usually for the worse, of course.
Yeah.
And so I do that. I also am the co-host of a podcast called Squaring the Strange, and we just celebrated our 3rd anniversary along with Celestia Ward and Pascual Romero, my co-host on that. And Squaring the Strange, you can find it on iTunes and elsewhere. And we do an episode every 2 weeks.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I want to end with a quote, and I didn't have time to source it because I think there's some dubious sourcing on this, and you might know better than I do because it sounds like it's right up your alley. But it's certainly the case that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. So, do you know where that came from? Because I think that was attributed to Churchill and Twain. And
yeah, I've heard it attributed to Twain mostly. Neither one of them probably wrote it. It probably just materialized out of nowhere. But
yep.
It's a great quote, and it's a great skeptical dictum as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Benjamin. We really appreciate you being here, and I will take you up on the offer to come back again sometime soon. Hopefully we are dealing with less coronavirus in the future, but I think we're all kind of locked into some routines right now and probably will be for just a little while. And it's nice of you to join us. And so welcome back to Florida virtually, I guess. But certainly when you get a chance to travel again and you can make it to Florida, we'll certainly put you up and get you some places to talk. So
I'd love to. That'd be great. Take care.
Right,
Thanks for having me.
You bet. All right, so a couple of things. In 2 weeks, we have a wonderful activist joining us to talk about a project she's been working on for several years. That's Susan Gerbic, and she's going to be talking about guerrilla skepticism on Wikipedia. And this project has had a profound impact on a resource that many of us use regularly. And she's actually been in touch with our organization to try to research some things that we know about. The mission of the Guerrilla Skepticism Project editing team is to improve science and skeptical content on Wikipedia. And they do this writing or improving skepticism in science-related articles, as well as the biographical articles of notable people involved in science and skepticism. So that's a fantastic resource and a project that we're going to hear about from Susan in 2 weeks from now. We're in talks also with Andrew Seidel of the Freedom from Religion Foundation to join us again for a conversation on Christian nationalism. As you know, he talked to us back in June on location here in Central Florida while he was traveling for family. But look for that announcement very soon once we nail that down. And on July 26th, we have booked Bill Schoolman of the Final Exit Network. This organization was formerly known as the Hemlock Society, and their mission is to educate qualified individuals in practical, peaceful ways to end their lives, offer a compassionate bedside presence, and defend their right to choose. So this talk will focus on death with dignity and the right to end one's own life, topics that are near and dear to us, not just for ourselves, but for family members and others that we want to support through the natural process of dying. As a reminder, we're continuing our meetup events, including Freethought cafes and secular women's events as Zoom meetings. So to find out more and how to join us there, you can sign up at meetup.com/CFL Freethought. Thanks.